ready, turning your Bibles to Genesis chapter 5. And this second section of Genesis that goes from really Genesis 4 all the way through Genesis 11. This is not inspired or anything, but in my mind, what makes most sense to call this section of Genesis is part 2, Babylon. And what this is a section of Genesis where after the fall, after human beings decide in the garden to reject God and choose autonomy and choose to define reality and morality apart from God, that everything begins to spiral downhill. But as it's spiraling downhill from the perspective of humans, it's almost like it's spiraling uphill, because humans are, over the course of Genesis 4 through 11, humans begin to take this personal rejection of God and build a community out of it. And what ends up as a civilization that stands under the judgment of God. And so the whole entire piece then is Babylon becomes in the Bible human empire, human community, human corporate identity set against God in rejection of his definition of what is real and what is good and evil. And that's Babylon. And one of the places that we see that played out throughout human history, and certainly in our day today, is in a great deal of confusion and deceit in the areas of sex and sexuality. And these concepts are so near and dear to the human soul, to a sense of who we are, who we conceive of ourselves to be, that throughout human history, one of the chief places where you can see human rebellion against God is in these areas of sex and sexuality. And that has led over the course of human history and is in our day leading to all kinds of societal problems. And we just can kind of see this in a sense kind of accelerating. Does it feel like that to anybody else? Like I think about today, what we're going to do is we're going to just, like I said, look at the first couple of verses of Genesis 5. And the reason is that once again, it returns to this idea that God made humanity in his image, which we talked about really at length back in Genesis 1. And then we mentioned that the image of God was made in humanity as male and female. And man, like 10 years ago, I probably would have just let that sit and moved on. And it's like something like in the last, 6 or 7 years, that simple statement that like humanity is male and female, that's a plain thing for everybody, has become not plain. Have you seen that? Now, one of the things that we could do way wrong, I think, as Christians, as the people of God, is to react really angrily to that. I don't think that's the proper reaction, because what response does Jesus have to sinful, confused people? Compassion and truth. And I wonder, gosh, like if Jesus were ministering personally today, how would our actions as believers measure up to his? Would we be as compassionate as he is? Would we be as truthful as he is? And I sort of fear that Christians in many ways can err on one of two sides of this. They can err on the exclusive compassion or the exclusive truth side of this issue. The exclusive compassion is really, it's cowardice that we mask with compassion. What I mean by that is this: I'm terrified to be called a bigot, and so I will not engage in difficult conversations with people in the areas of sex and sexuality. So that's one way that the church is responding to this confusion in our culture today, is silence, because we're afraid of how people might respond. Then the other, of course, the other mistake is that we just come out of the gate, guns blazing, as it were, shouting truth at people without any actual compassion for human beings made in the image of God and in a place that we consider to be deceived, confused, sinful. So we don't want to miss any of those. Does this make sense? Are we all right with this so far? So we need to have difficult conversations, but we need to have them with grace, with compassion, with truth. And I want to engage in some of those conversations over the next 2 weeks. And so what I want to address today is just this simple idea of male and female. I want to try to meet this problem head on as best that I can. and try to provide us a sense of where our culture is today and then what the biblical teaching is on this area. And I say this with just like in this regard, I don't know what sort of experiences people have had in this. I don't know what relationships you have in your family. I know that it gets really, really hard. Historically, the church has a teaching, for example, and this will be more for next week, but on homosexuality. And it's one thing to sort of talk about that conceptually. It's another thing entirely when you have a family member in your family who's gay. And now you actually have to figure out, but I love this person. And so I don't want them to feel like I've rejected them, like I stand in condemnation over them, but I don't want to lie to them either. I don't want to pretend like I don't believe what I believe in. And all of a sudden, the theoretical issue is a good deal more difficult. Do you see that? And the same thing kind of happens today where a lot of people can fly off the handle pontificate about, transgenderism, gender dysmorphia, these different kinds of things. And it's one thing to sort of say some things that we believe and we think are true. It's another thing entirely when you have someone near to you who's actually struggling deeply with gender dysphoria and you're trying to love that person. Because then it's not a hypothetical issue. It's a real issue. It's a real human being. And so this is very tricky. And I want to try to give us a sense of where this is in our culture more broadly, and then what the Christian response ought to be. Are we okay? This is where we're at today. So we're going to start here. We're not going to start with we read the Genesis 5, the first few verses there. What I want to start with is the contemporary view of sex and gender. Okay? We live in a world today of relativity. So we view knowledge, truth itself, and by we, I don't mean we, I mean culturally, broadly, in our society. Our society views truth and morality as relative and not real. Okay? So our culture, by and large, follows what we might call a postmodern view that objective truth, and then tied to that, objective morality that exists, whatever I think of it, or truth that exists, whether I know it or not. Okay? Our culture believes that those things, objective truth and objective morality, either don't exist or they might exist, but they are unattainable for any human being, flawed and finite and biased as we are. And so then what this leads to is a second principle of postmodernism. There's that knowledge principle. Nothing is real, or if it is, we can't see it very clearly. So then what happens is, because of that, any claim on the part of a person to know objective truth or morality is seen as nothing more than a power play. Okay? So the idea is, if I'm looking at you and I say, I believe that there's no way that you know objective truth, and then you make a claim of objective truth to me, if I'm in the postmodern school of thought, I'm going to interpret your claim to truth. I know that you don't actually know truth, so why are you saying that you know truth? Because you want to exert some kind of influence or power over me. And this is why so much of the conversation culturally today, and even politically, it's the talk about power, oppressive power that's seen in every nook and cranny of society. There's really no conversation today about truth. People today, this is something that Christians, we don't really get. The culture at large doesn't actually care nearly as much as we do about this thing that we call truth, because they don't see it. What they believe is that power, everything boils down to power. Nobody really knows what's going on, and all the people that claim to know what's going on are really just playing power games. So then how does this show up in conclusions that are drawn in our culture regarding sex and sexuality and self-identity and all of that? Well, it shows up like this. If there is no objective truth that exists, then that is up to and including human identity, human. So today, there is no agreed upon definition of what makes a person human. Like, what is a human being? So you can see this, for example, show up over and over again in the debate in our culture surrounding the morality and legality of abortion. There's confusion there. Our culture does not have agreement on what is and is not a human person. So because of that, because there's no objective truth out there to be had, it falls to each individual person to forge and affirm their own identity. And that is up to and including the concepts of sex and gender. Now, what do we mean when we say sex and gender? When we say sex, we are referring to the biological makeup of a human being. So things like chromosomes, sexual reproductive organs, and the kind of gametes that a body produces, whether eggs or sperm. That's sex, yes? When we say gender, this is a word that in our culture today refers to the personal behavioral characteristics of a specific, of an individual. So here we're not talking about the biology as such. We're talking about things like masculine versus feminine. So masculine or man, feminine or woman. So there's a great deal of controversy here. The controversy actually with the term gender, the word gender was not used with reference to human beings until the 1950s and 60s. So before that, the word gender was only used with grammar because many languages, English is not real strong on this, but many languages are gendered languages. And what that means is that the language has words or forms of words that are masculine or feminine, but that's not referring to like human anything. It's just masculine or feminine words. So like this is in both Hebrew and Greek, the biblical languages. There are words in, so for example, the Greek word for sin, hamartia, is a feminine word, but it's just grammatically feminine. It doesn't mean that sin is like a uniquely feminine quality. Does that make sense? There's nothing there that like, oh, so only women sin and men, you know. Now some men act like that's the case, but that's not at all the case. It's grammatical gender is not the same thing as like human. And so for most of human history, the word gender was not used to talk about human gender. It started to be used that way in the 1960s, and there is a whole entire story here that I was going to give the whole story, but I can't because time, and also because it's so disturbing. There's a man named John Money. Anybody familiar with John Money? Okay, go Google John Money and you'll find the rest of this story. He was a psychologist and a scientist in the 1960s. And most famously, he pioneered the idea that a person's gender identity was entirely malleable. So he coined the idea, he began the idea, really, that human sex and gender were not some real inherent trait that a person was born with, but rather something that could be shaped. Okay, so you can see kind of where this has gone. Now, John Money was an absolutely disgusting human being. Absolutely disgusting. Most famously, what he is known for now, but nobody ever says this anymore because the activism of today does not like to acknowledge that this is really the start of everything. He did an experiment on children, the most famous of which was these twin boys. And I'm going to spare you the details of this story, but twin boys that he experimented on trying to prove that sex and gender were malleable. And so they're twin boys. One of these boys was raised as a boy, the other one was raised as a girl. There was surgeries involved. There was, honestly, like what by any normal person's standards would be considered pedophilia. And both of these twins ended up in their adulthood taking their own lives. It's an extraordinarily tragic story. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can just go Google John Money. And I don't want to go there, but the point is this. The broad point is John Money was an absolutely disgusting man, but he was extraordinarily influential. For the period of 30 years, nobody actually contested his research. So he began publishing academic literature saying, because of his experiments on these boys, that look, like human sex and gender, it's 100% nurture, no nature. There's nothing intrinsic here. It's just whatever people form. And this has exactly turned into the concept today. And this is like, might laugh at this, but the concept, like sometimes people today have babies and they call them babies. And they call them babies because they believe that they have not been born with any intrinsic sex or gender, and that those things are only going to emerge as this child forges that identity for themselves. And that idea began in the 1960s with John Money. So today then, what that means is, I'm not saying not everybody thinks that, but today there is no agreement on what relationship sex, biological sex, has to gender. There's just no agreement there. There are, broadly speaking, 4 ways that people think about these in our culture today. The first is this. The first is gender and sex are the same thing. So in other words, to be male is the same thing as to be masculine. Yes? To be female is the same exact thing as to be feminine. That's the way, number one, that we can think about this issue. Number 2, gender is connected to sex, but it's not the same thing. So we would say something like this. We'd say this. Is every human male a man? No, because boys. So when we use the term man, we would say a man is a mature human male, right? The proper adult expression of human male is man. And the proper adult expression of human female is woman. Now, this is the view that I would hold. And we can get into why that is. The third view that begins to diverge from what any Christian would be able to hold in good faith. The third view is that gender is completely distinct from sex. So the idea that sex is real, but gender is not. And this is the most common form of transgenderism, the ideology in our culture today. The affirmation that, yes, biological sex may be real, but that doesn't mean that a person has to be that gender identity. They're totally different things. They're not at all connected. So a person, for example, can be biologically male, but have a gender identity of woman. That's the transgender activism of our day today. And then lastly, the view that is the most radical view in our society today is that both gender and sex are complete fictions. Neither of them has any bearing in objective reality. Both sex and gender are entirely what we would say socially constructed. So what do we think of these options? Well, number 4 is just totally untenable for a Christian to hold. Yes? It's just not what we believe. That doesn't mean we should hate people to hold that view. No. Okay, does it mean we should belittle them and stand in judgment over them? No, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean we definitely don't agree with their view. We just don't believe that. Christians don't believe that sex and gender are fiction. The option 3, if we could put those options back up just so we can see them and take a quick inventory of them. Option 3 is also untenable for a Christian. We don't believe that a person can be biologically one thing and then just be a different thing. Okay? That's not what again, does that mean we should hate people who have gender dysphoria? Who are what is gender dysphoria? Gender dysphoria is when a person biologically is one sex, but they feel a profound sense of alienation from their own body, so that they feel really like they ought to be a different gender. Now it'd be so easy for people to just take this judgmental stance and mock such people, but this is a real condition. It's a real struggle that people have, a sense of alienation from their very self. And I think that the Christian should meet such a person with compassion. Again, how did Jesus approach the sexually deviant people in his culture? He sat down and ate meals with them. Now, does that mean he just totally affirmed everything that they thought about human sexuality? Absolutely not. He didn't. But Jesus was accused of being what? A glutton and a drunkard. Why? Because he sat down with sinful people. And not the socially acceptable sins, the socially unacceptable sins. So this is a view, number 3, that we don't hold, but doesn't mean we have to be uncompassionate toward people. We feel okay about that? So we're kind of left with 1 and 2. Now, The simpler, maybe more traditional view is the first. Gender and sex are the same thing. And maybe people, they may be more comfortable with that. Male is masculine, and female is feminine, and they're the exact same thing. The problem is that lacks the ability to actually describe reality as we see it, right? So as soon as we say, like if I say this, a male, a human male, in adolescence, a juvenile, may physiologically mature, but not mature in any other way. Would you agree with that? And what term would we use for such people in our society? Would we say they are men? I'd say no. I'd say they're physically mature boys. Like they never actually matured in a whole way. So you can see like 40-year-old men who have never taken responsibility for anybody else, who haven't even taken responsibility for their own selves. And we look at that kind of person and we say, so I'm actually a little uncomfortable with the idea that I'm going to lump them in categorically with men who have matured basically. I'm not saying that they're perfect, but men who have taken responsibility for their own lives, taken responsibility for themselves, and yes, taken responsibility for other people. So the idea then is, number two, I would say, is probably the most helpful way to think about sex and gender. Sex is real, gender is real. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're integrally connected. How are we doing so far? I'm going to do something I don't normally do. People are always allowed to ask a question in a sermon, just so you know that. There's one young lady in our church that often will raise her hand and ask a question. I love that. I'm just going to say that. Are there any questions? All right, let's move on. So what's the biblical teaching? What's the biblical teaching? Well, the first is this. The first thing that we have to understand, again, in opposition to our culture, is that both sex and gender are real. They are not social constructs. They are not fiction. We saw this back in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. And immediately, people, what about intersex people? That's a whole different topic, and frankly, we don't have time for that today. But the normative human reality is that people are male and female. That's the normative reality. Are some people born in some sense outside of that binary of sex? Yes. In the same way, some people are born with 11 fingers. Now, it doesn't mean we don't mock those people. We don't say, oh my gosh, you're a weird freak. Like, we don't do anything like that. It's just to say that, like, the basic idea is that the normative human reality is male and female. Yes? And this is reiterated in Genesis chapter 5. It starts this way. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. So male and female is not something that humans create. It's not something that we have socially constructed. It is a biological reality that God has created. So again, it's 10 years ago, I would never have had to say this out loud. Today, I'll get canceled for it, or not canceled because I'm not that big of a deal, but I might get shadow banned on YouTube or whatever. It might be hard to find this sermon later. But here, simple statement, and I think it's like all of human history has borne witness to this. Males are not females. And females are not males. And I've mentioned this before. A comedian that I've watched before has said it very succinctly. He says, my favorite thing about my wife is that she's not a man. Right? Men are not women, and women are not men. And really, more specifically, men and women are not interchangeable. Now, to say that statement is going to, at some point along the way, get very uncomfortable. Because this is one of the things I struggled with this all week long, and really beyond this. It's easy for me to say men and women are not the same. Yes? Now, how about this question? How precisely are they different? Women smell better. Oh my gosh, thank you. Solved. Have a good week. Oh my gosh. So there's a simple reality. Now, why do we struggle as a culture to recognize this very simple reality? And I propose it's this. This is not something new to our society. It's not something new to our culture. This is the human way. We create reality apart from God. We say, God, we will define it. And in our culture, here's how I think we define it. We live in a culture in which the most real thing that we can imagine is our feelings. We conceive of reality as we don't even know. Like, we live in a day where we're debating in our culture today whether we all live in a simulation. Which is a crazy thought. Rabbit trail, don't do it, Brian. Don't do it. But in this context, what ends up happening is we conceive of who is the real you. And we're taught to answer that question with the real me is an internal, self-conscious experience of who I think I am. And so we don't live in such a way as to recognize what is real and true independently from myself and then seek to align myself with that. Instead, we live in a way where we recognize what we feel and then we seek to align everything with that. And so in a very real sense, what that results in, we culturally are modern day Gnostics. In the ancient world, there was a group of people, the Gnostics, and it came from gnosis, G-N-O-S-I-S, knowledge. And these were people who thought that they possessed secret, like transcendent knowledge. And really how it showed up in their worldview is they believed the physical world to be evil. And the good thing is the mental reality, the spiritual reality. And we sometimes, even in the church, we act like this is the case. We're modern day Gnostics. We believe that the physical world is less real than the internal world of the feelings and of the spirit. And so then that results in, logically, if that's true, then we view our bodies as superfluous. It doesn't matter. Our bodies then we come to view as a suit that we can change as we see fit in order to match our internal perception of who we are. That's how our culture conceives of reality. Reality is my internal sense, my internal feelings, and then what we try to do is align the outside reality that we perceive to that inner reality. Now, the problem with this, there are several. The first problem is this simple thought. We are not our feelings. Now, don't mistake what I'm saying there. I'm not saying that we don't have feelings, and I'm not saying that feelings are bad. What I'm saying is that we are not identified as nothing more than the sum total of our feelings. And further, we routinely experience feelings that do not correspond to reality. Have you ever felt this? In whatever way you might have experienced this. Sometimes it's anxiety. And what's real is inside you feel a sense of like things are going to melt down at any minute. But that doesn't correspond with reality. Things are not going to melt down at any minute. Or you feel a sense of profound inadequacy that makes you depressed and you don't try anything. And why do you not try anything? Because you just have this profound inner sense that whatever you try, it's going to fail. It's like you think that you have the opposite of the Midas touch, right? Midas in mythology, everything he touches turns to gold. And you think you are afraid. Your feelings, your internal sense tells you that everything you touch is going to die. But that's not true. That does not correspond with reality. The reality is if you show up and try with an honest effort, 90% of the time you'll succeed. This is a crazy thing. Like young people, aside from the whole conversation, male, female, sex, gender, let me just tell you something. One of the things that's going to happen in your life is you're going to be afraid that you're going to fail. And sometimes you will. But most of the time, if you show up and you give an honest effort, you're probably going to do all right. And your fear, your internal feeling that that's not the case, does not correspond with reality. So the first problem with our view that we are our feelings is that our feelings just often do not at all correspond with reality. One of the things that we can do when people are feeling a profound sense of alienation from their own selves, whether it's gender dysmorphia or any other kind of thing, is number one, to have compassion on people and to recognize what someone is feeling. You know that's a good thing to do, right? It's okay to recognize that someone is struggling in their internal sense of who they are. It's okay to have compassion on that. And then also, it's okay to gently try to help people see that they are not their feelings. Their feelings do not at all necessarily correspond to reality. So that's problem number one with the view that we are our feelings, and therefore I can edit the external real world to suit my internal reality. Problem number two, to believe that sex and gender are not real is especially abusive to women. Nobody's willing to say, well, not nobody's, a few people are, but they're regarded as bigots in our culture today. But even feminists, and I disagree with radical feminists on many great number of things, but as one feminist writer points out, we put this up on the screen, she says, this is Linda Alcoff, she says, if gender identity is simply a social construct, then the need and even the possibility of a feminist politic becomes immediately problematic. What can we demand in the name of women if women do not exist? And demands in their name simply reinforce the myth that they do. How can we speak out against sexism as detrimental to the interests of women if the category is a fiction? Okay, so again, I don't agree with radical feminists on many things, but this is a sensible statement. This is truth. On what grounds can you advocate for justice for women if the category is a complete fiction? And one of the most volatile examples of this today is, of course, in sports. This has become a big cultural issue, lots of different places where this is playing out. But it's becoming an issue because the field of athletics is one place where the reality of male and female, man and woman, is most difficult to ignore. So we can have all of our thoughts about sex and gender being social constructs and all of that. There's no real difference there. But as soon as people show up on an athletic field, it becomes very quickly apparent that these are not the same category. There are actual differences here. And it's becoming like activism is seeking to place biological men into various kinds of sports. And we're going to see just how abusive that is. And I say it's uniquely abusive to women because, for example, in the area of sports, there's really no tangible problem if a biological woman decides to compete in a male arena. We don't like that on the sort of truth level, but there's no tangible problem there. If a woman steps into a boxing ring with a man, she's not really likely to hurt him. Yes? The reverse is not true. And so this whole idea, it's uniquely abusive to women. And this is one of the reasons, and I say this is one of the things that's going to get me canceled, but I am very resistant to the compelled speech standards of our day, wherein we're supposed to use preferred pronouns for people. This is one of the places where Christians are pressured to be nice. But here's my problem with this. I think that every time that I refer to a biological male as she, I am in that moment saying that the category of woman is entirely fictional. And it's irrelevant. So then my thought on that is, in doing that, I am dishonoring and disrespecting the reality of womanhood for every woman. And again, this is something people are not willing to say. But if I agree that the category of woman doesn't exist and is a complete fiction, I think that's fundamentally dishonoring to women. And so because of that, okay, now I'm not going to be like obnoxious and intentionally a jerk about this, but it is the problem that I have with the speech standards today, where by my very speech I am compelled to agree with a worldview that I think is fundamentally abusive to women. So that's a problem. That's a problem. Now, I'm very privileged. I'm a pastor. I spend most of my time in my office praying, reading, writing, talking mostly with Christians. And so that's easy for me to say. It's much harder if you're in the workplace and you're actually being compelled via a company handbook that you have to obey these compelled speech standards. Very, very difficult. And I'm not trying to tell you exactly how to handle that. I'm just telling you my view on that. Is I think if we concede the ground that womanhood doesn't exist, I think it's fundamentally disrespectful to women. How are we doing with that? The last problem with this view that sex and gender are not real is that it denies the goodness and reality of the body. Right? It's that Gnostic view. But God made humanity in his image, but we can go one step further than that. God made humanity in his image as male and female, which means that the most accurate statement that I can make about myself is not simply that I am human, but that in particular, I am a human man and not a human woman. God created human beings as embodied, that is to say, sexed souls. So what that means that in the Christian view of things, your body is not a suit that you wear with the real you inside. That's not the Christian view. Now sometimes we can get in that direction because we misunderstand the meaning of biblical teaching, like out of the mouth or out of the heart comes the words of the mouth. And we can misunderstand that as Jesus saying, oh, like the real you is inside and the mouth is just kind of like a part of the suit that you wear. But that's not the point there. The point is, in places like that, the Bible, Jesus, is saying that the reality of your character dictates your actions. He's not saying that your body is just a meat suit that you put on and will someday take off as, that's not it. Okay, the real you includes and involves your body, your male body or your female body. And so the real you includes such things as your vital organs, your muscle and bone, your hormones, testosterone, estrogen, etc., etc. That's the real you. The real you is embodied. And if we think that sex and gender are complete fiction, we miss the actual goodness of the body that God has created us with. Which then leads us to the biblical teaching. Number one, sex and gender are real. Number two, sex and gender are good. Here in Genesis 5, verse 2, you can put that back up on the screen. Male and female, he created them, and then what? He blessed them, and he named them. God blessed humanity as male and female. To be one sex and not the other is not a limitation or oppression or curse. It is a blessing. It is a blessing to be a human man. And it is a blessing to be a human woman. Now you can look back through the annals of history and you can say, well, doggone it, at some points it sure doesn't look like a blessing to, say, be a human woman. But that's not because of the reality of man, woman, male, female. It's because human men are corrupt and sinful. And as we saw in Genesis 3, the destiny of the sexes is to be engaged in conflict. And tragically and lamentably, that conflict pretty much universally throughout human history ends with men on top and women subjugated and oppressed. But that's not the problem. That's not the curse of man and woman. It's the curse of sin. God blessed humanity, and so to be one sex and not the other is a good thing. And then God names humanity. Corporately, the text there says, God named them Adam. Now, the Hebrew word Adam sometimes refers to the individual man, the first man. But often, not even just in Genesis, the Hebrew term refers to mankind, human folk. And God named humanity. Now, what does it mean that God named humanity? Well, the account in Genesis pictures God as a father. The exact same language that's used of God. God created them, male and female, and he blessed them and he named them Adam, created them in his likeness. That exact same language is used in the very next verse of what Adam does. It says that Adam fathered a son in his likeness, and he named him Seth. So you have likeness, the blessing of a name, the naming of a baby. What is that saying? It's saying that God is being pictured in Genesis 5 as the first father. And just so we get this very clear, it's not saying that God is kind of like Adam. Adam was like a real father, and then God's kind of like that. That's not what Genesis is saying. It's saying that God is in his nature a father who begets children, and Adam is like that. The definition of what it means to be, on this level, a human father, doesn't start with humanity, it starts with God. This is a very practical note for anybody who has ever had a difficult relationship with your father. And then what happens is the language of God as father gets used, and you're like, I'm out. Because your view of that is that you're viewing with primacy your human father, and then you're saying, well, if God is like that, then I don't want to have anything to do with him. But that's not what the Bible teaches us. It actually says that, no, God is the most real father who creates children and names them and blesses them. And human fathers are supposed to be like that. And then when they're not, it's corruption and wickedness and evil. So God blesses and he names humanity as male and female. It's not just real, it's good. Sex and gender are good. We see this on an individual level as well. God makes carefully, with love, individual people. This is Psalm 139, verse 13. You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. Wonderful are your works, O God. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. God forms with love and care every single person. So what does this mean then? It means that in whatever way that God has made us, human male, human female, man or woman, it's not just real, but it is good. It is a blessing. God made you precisely the way he wanted to make you. Wonderful are his works. And what that means then in practice is that God knows you better than you know you. And man, meditate on that thought. I challenge you to do that. God knows you. He knows you more intimately and profoundly and truly than you know you. And this is, I think, good news. For example, to a person with body dysmorphia of any kind, for the person who feels a sense of alienation or discomfort in their own body, it's okay. It's okay to feel that. It's compassionate and kind to recognize the suffering that's involved with such a condition. But it's also compassionate and kind to say that despite however we may feel about ourselves, God actually made us, and he knows us better than we know ourselves. And so then the basis on which we can say that my feelings are not reality, right? My feelings are not reality for the sole reason that God creates reality. God made me. I didn't make me. He created me. He knows me. He has a purpose for me. And this is good news, not just for the person with gender dysmorphia, but for every human being. And why is that? Because one of the things that I think is overlooked in this whole conversation, sometimes people go to these issues of sex and sexuality and they say, well, this is an issue that's so near to a person. It's their very sense of self. And so, like, how can you say that that's sinful? Or how can you say that that's misaligned? Well, I can say every person is to some extent misaligned. Every person is alienated from their very self. This is Genesis 3. Right? Adam and Eve, they reject God. They turn their back on God. And then what happens? They realize that they're naked. And they don't like what they see. Why? How do we know that? Because they are ashamed. And right there, in the fall of humanity, what we see is because of sin, people are not just alienated from God. We're not just alienated from one another. We are alienated from our very self. We do not know ourselves truly. We don't understand ourselves. We're not at peace perfectly with ourselves. Is anybody completely at peace with yourself? To one extent or another, in many different ways, every person experiences a sense of alienation from their own sense of being. Have you ever felt a sense of discouragement and frustration with your own body? Not even in the gender dysmorphia, but perhaps because of physical features that you don't like on your own body. Perhaps because of illness or injury. Perhaps because of actual body dysmorphia. Whatever it is, the Bible actually doesn't shy away from this. It teaches that life in this fallen and broken world presents us with a fundamental inability to be completely and perfectly at peace, even with ourselves. And so human beings, one of the realities of the human condition in the fall is that we don't actually really know who we are. And that statement is true, not just of the person with gender dysmorphia. We fundamentally don't know who we are. I can prove that to you. Just on how much money is made by people who make personality tests. Every time you've ever taken a personality test, I suspect, if you're anything like me, it's because there lurks something within you that you want to find out something about yourself that somebody else can give you insight on. Why do people take a personality test, if not because I don't actually know myself as I want to? This is an insane thought. This is why I say you need to meditate on this. We sometimes can lament, man, it's hard to know other people, right? It's hard to connect. You're going too fast. It's hard for you to know you. It's difficult. And so it's like it should not actually surprise us that people are not always perfectly at peace with themselves. It should not surprise us to find that people experience things like body dysmorphia. I would never promise that every person will always be perfectly at peace with themselves. I think that's part of the fall. But I do know that ultimately in Christ, we will come to know ourselves truly, not as we feel in this life, but as God has truly made us. There's this fascinating spot in the book of Revelation where Jesus says, to the one who endures, to the one who overcomes, I will give them a stone, and written on that stone is a name that no one knows except the person who receives it. It's like there's this name, there's this reality of who you and I are that we can't even see, we can't even get to. And the eschatological hope of human identity is that in Christ someday he'll show me who I really am. And I'll spend my years on earth here trying to figure it out the best that I can, but always coming up short. I'm not totally sure. I don't really understand myself. This is why the Bible so often say in the Psalms, you find David talking to himself. And he says, why so downcast, my soul? Put your hope in God. What do you think is going on there except some sense of alienation from his very self? And why is it, do you think, that Jesus tells people, if anyone wants to follow after me, he has to deny himself? He has to deny his very sense of being in order to come find it in me. And this is the gospel. This is why we can't go along with the we are our feelings culture. It's not because we hate people. It's not because we stand in judgment over them. It's not because we stand as superior to them. It's because we are beggars who are trying to point people to the one who can give us some bread. We are people, we don't have it all figured out. But we know that the only way we're going to ever really know ourselves is through the one who made us, and we're trying to point people to him. If we don't understand that sex and gender are real and good, we will never be able to purposely live as God created us to. God has created us as he has for a purpose. And that's why we can't ultimately separate male from man and masculine, or female from woman and feminine. God created human males to be men, and he created human females to be women. He has purpose and goodness in how he's made us. So I want to take a brief stab, and I invite you to have this conversation in your families, in your small groups, in your friend groups. As I said at the beginning here, it's relatively easy to say male and female are real and not the same thing. And even it's easy to say man and woman, those are real categories, and they're not the same thing. It's very difficult to say exactly how are they different. Or to put the question another way, okay, so to be a mature human male, that's what it means to be a man. But that just begs the question, what is a mature human male? What is the essential nature of godly masculinity? And what is the essential nature of godly femininity? And this is actually a pretty difficult question to answer. And the reason is that we often attach to the terms man and masculine or woman and feminine relatively shallow issues of behavior and roles, culturally, things that are culturally given to us, right? Things that are at rock bottom, not really what it means to be a masculine man in a godly sense or a feminine woman. So behavior examples, let me illustrate this. We might say femininity is bound up in, like, women are more gentle and soft-spoken and passive, and men are more aggressive and assertive. Now, have you ever seen that kind of play out? Sure. Is that always the case? No. No. To use kind of a cultural stereotype, have you ever met an Italian woman? So we can see there, like, okay, so like the behavior piece, that's not really quite going to do it. We're not going to bind up femininity in gentle and soft-spoken. We're not going to bind up masculinity in aggressive and assertive. Sometimes we think of it in terms of roles. So we might say like this type of thought. Okay, well, so femininity, women, they cook and clean, and men work outside the home. First, like, that's just not biblical. Like, go read Proverbs 31. Like that, if there is a picture of the ideal woman, the most feminine woman in the Bible, it's Proverbs 31. Go read it. I'm not going to exposit the whole thing today, but I will just point out that the Proverbs 31 woman engages in business and economics. She's making products. She's going out and trading them with merchants. So it's not simply these rigid roles. That's not the definition of masculine and feminine. There's no biblical command regarding who takes on what household roles or chores exactly. Do you see how this is difficult? It's a difficult question. So what is then the biblical teaching? Well, to some extent, I think that the reality of masculine and feminine, gender, man and woman, are concepts that do derive directly from the reality of male and female. So I think that there are some clues to this in the very way that God has built men and women. So for example, generally speaking, men are, not men specific, like just the male body is generally constructed differently than the female body, yes? In what way? Well, men are physically more powerful, are generally capable of a greater speed and strength with a higher density of bone and muscle. Yes? That's like how men are built. Women are uniquely capable of birthing and nurturing children, from the ability to grow a human baby to the ability to breastfeed, and even to the emotional capacities to nurture and care for children. So there's a difference, right? So on the physical and biological level, it would seem that masculinity has something to do with a greater power. Like, this is a controversial statement today, but I think it's patently self-evident. Men are generally more powerful than women. And we kind of miss this because we live in an exceedingly civilized culture today. We live in a culture where this is never going to really, well, I don't know, never say never. But we don't see it very likely as playing out. But in every place, like, so for example, let me say this. For all of our sort of fictional media, where you have societies that are governed by women, it doesn't exist by and large in human history. Now you think, well, wait a second, but there have been women like monarchs, right? Yes, that's true. But there are no women monarchs who have risen to power by conquering other people. They've been sort of born into the role, and a king dies, and now his daughter becomes queen. That's not quite the same thing. Historically, how men become monarchs is they kill everybody who's competing with them. Now, I'm not commenting on whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying it's human history. The normative experience of humans is that men become the rulers of a society. Why? Because when push comes to shove, they can enforce their will. And again, I am not saying that that's good. I'm saying that you can see something in the difference between men and women just on the history of what has happened throughout human history. And I think that's a clue. I think part of the biblical teaching is that it doesn't have to do with personality characteristics or roles. I think it has to do with what a person chooses to do with how God has made them. So I think godly masculinity has to do with the willingness to use the power that you have available to you, not to conquer women and children, but to protect and provide for them, to bless them. And I think femininity is built into the cake. There is a responsive nature to that in response to that, babies can be born in a stable environment and the ability to create and nurture life. Now, as soon as I say that, it's like, well, what about people who never get married? Yes, fair enough. But I think that the normative experience for human beings, the one that the Bible most consistently and clearly speaks to, is the assumption that people get married and have babies. So I think that the reality of masculinity and femininity is most clearly seen in that context. At least that's the context that the Bible speaks most consistently to. Men as husbands and women as wives. Does that mean that every man is going to be a husband? No. Does it mean that every woman is going to be a wife? No. What it means is that we have to take the principles as the Bible gives them to us and try to thoughtfully and carefully and wisely figure out how they work out in other contexts. Yes? Now, I think that this idea of power for the benefit of others and a response to that in creating and nurturing life, I think that that's found in the New Testament. For example, in 1 Peter chapter 3, look what Peter says to husbands. He says, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. Now, the Greek here is very difficult, and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of it. Live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. A lot of things that we could talk about there. Again, I'm not going to exposit 1 Peter 3, but I want to point this out. That Peter knows, okay, what? That women are a physically weaker vessel, generally speaking. Yes? And now, husbands, what are you to do with that? She's not as strong as me, so she's less than. No. No. Instead, she is an heir with you to the grace of life. And if you don't act like it, God will not hear your prayers. So then what's the implication? That husbands, men, it may be true that you have a certain degree of power and force and formidable capability that other people don't have, but that does not give you permission to conquer them, to dominate them, to oppress them, to subjugate them. Rather, you're supposed to actually use that power that you have, whatever it is. You're supposed to choose to do something good with it. And what is that something good? You are to choose to take responsibility for other people's well-being and use the power that you have to bless, to protect, to provide for others. And this is seen in every teaching on sex or gender in the New Testament. There is a clear pattern throughout the New Testament to the idea of male headship, but it never refers to the use of male authority for self-interest. Every time that the New Testament says, say women submit to your husbands, that's a regular New Testament teaching. It's found in Colossians 3, in 1 Peter 3, in Ephesians 5. It's consistent. So the idea then is like, okay, so wives submit to their husbands and men have some amount of authority there. But then when it gets to the men, it never says anything about their authority. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't mean they don't have any, but what it says is, here's what you have, men. You have a set of duties and obligations and responsibilities. And what you are to use your power, and if we want to use the word authority, what you are to use that for is those duties and obligations and responsibilities. This is one of the myths of leadership that we have today. Today, because we see so many leaders abuse their leadership and use their authority and power for self-interest, we think that that's what it means to be a leader. Not so, says God. The ultimate example of leadership is Jesus, who died. So leadership in the Bible, headship in the Bible, is not about I get to tell other people what to do. And I get to bless myself because I have greater power, because I'm higher up on the totem pole. Actually, in the Bible, if you have greater power, what that does is obligate you to stand underneath other people and lift them up and bless them, protect them, provide for them, sacrifice for them. Jesus Christ is the model there. Yes? So here's what I think is godly masculinity. I don't think it comes down to your personality. I don't think it comes down to the specific roles that you adopt. I think godly masculinity comes down to this basic idea: whether or not you are willing to take responsibility for other people than yourself. That's what I think. Now, do women not take responsibility for anybody? No. But I think that this is a godly essence of masculinity. I've said this before. I think that someday I will stand before God and I'll have a different conversation with him about our family than how he will talk with Kelsey. I think that I bear a responsibility for the well-being of our family that is not the same exact kind of responsibility that she bears. I think I am to take responsibility for other people. So what should we do with that then? Well, men, you are a godly masculine man, not if you work out and hunt and fish and do these things that we might traditionally associate with masculinity and build stuff or whatever. All those things are good. I like to do all those things. But that's not the essence of godly masculinity. The essence of godly masculinity is whether you are willing to take what God has given you and use it for the benefit of other people, take responsibility for their well-being. Now, in marriage, that will look a certain way. In the church, it will look a certain way. In different contexts, it will look different, and I trust that the Holy Spirit will grant you wisdom to know what it should look like in different scenarios. Now, biblical femininity. What is this then? Well, I think it's modeled for us, again, in Jesus Christ and the church. This is what Paul does in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 22. Speaking in the context of marriage, he says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." But then notice what he roots that in, what he builds that on. What he builds it on is the gospel. He says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, as like in a similar fashion to as Christ is the head of the church." his body and is himself its Savior. Now, this doesn't mean that men are the savior of their wives in the way that Jesus atones for the sins of people. But it does mean, how does the church submit to Christ? How does the church respond to him? Not as a passive, inactive doormat, right? But as a cheerful, joyful, active participant in what Jesus is doing. So I think that the essence of godly femininity is the willingness to respond to the exercise of godly male power. It's a dance. It's a dance. Now, sometimes people, they'll criticize and they'll say, wait a second, are you saying that women cannot be defined and identified apart from men? And I'd say, yes. And also, men cannot be identified and defined apart from women. I think that's the Bible. I think that's Genesis 1. God made them male and female. And I don't think you can actually know what either one of those things is without the other. So that's the idea. Like, men, you're not a man until you take responsibility for other people besides just yourself. How's that for you can't define man apart from other people? And the idea in the Bible is that I think likewise women are to respond to the initiative, in the context of marriage, the initiative of their husbands with freedom, joy, and competent support and aid and partnership. So I said this is like a dance. We could illustrate this with the idea of ballroom dancing. If you've ever done any ballroom or watched any ballroom dancing or know anything about ballroom dancing, I don't do ballroom dancing. I am, surprise, not a dancer. But in ballroom dancing, Kelsey, my wife, she is a dancer. She danced for many years. She's fantastic. In ballroom dancing, there is a leader and a follower. The male is the leader and the female is the follower. But it's not at all about hierarchy or who's better or worse or anyone bossing anyone around. Rather, it's the idea that there is a leader of this dance and the person who's responding to that leadership. But the job of the leader is to make the woman look good. That's the whole thing. That's the whole point of ballroom dancing. There is leadership, but it's not to make him look good. His leadership in taking the first step and directing the direction, the vision, path of the dance is for the exclusive purpose of lifting this woman up. And then her job's to respond to that and do that. And I think that's the idea. So too in life, the headship and power of men is to be used for the benefit and blessing of women and children. And the role of women is to actively respond to that and dance with him. Now, that's in marriage, plays out in a unique way. Ephesians chapter 5 says, wives, submit to your own husbands, not to every man everywhere. Okay, so I don't really see it as I would never approach a woman in our church and say, you have to submit to me because I'm a man and I'm going to tell you such and such whatever. That'd be so wrong on a number of levels. Okay, that's not what we say at all. Generally, I think that if a woman in our church needs to hear something and she's married, probably her husband will say it to her and they can fight about it. I don't need to do that. But we can carefully and thoughtfully extrapolate this principle. I think that the basic idea baked into the cake, right? I think in humanity, there is supposed to be a male leading, a male headship, a male exercise of power in sacrifice. And then there's supposed to be a response of women joyfully and cheerfully to respond to that initiative. And that plays out in a very specific way in marriage. I mean, it literally plays out in the raising of children. Women conceive and grow and birth and nurture children, but only after something else, right? So they're quite literally baked into biology. Is this a man has to get the thing started? And there is no child until that initiative. And throughout human history, that's been seen in the very act of marriage. Men ask women to marry them, and then they make babies with them. And women do what they are uniquely able to do as a response to that very initiative. So how do you extrapolate that into other areas? Like, for example, in our church believes that our church is to be led by godly, courageous, wise, spiritually mature men. These are men who have taken responsibility for our church. That's a big job. Big job. And I think it is godly masculinity to do that very thing, to take responsibility. And we then believe that the women of our church are to respond to this leadership with competent, cheerful, engaged aid as active participants. We do not in our church want women who don't participate, who never speak, who never give their ideas, who never have anything important to say, who never do anything like that. We don't believe that at all. We believe that men should step up in our church and initiate and use whatever power, whatever authority we might possess, not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of our whole church, and that the women of our church, by God's grace, would partner with the men of our church, that we could dance, that we could do something beautiful together as a church, that we could hold out the hope of the gospel in our community, that we could hold out a hope of men and women actually getting along rather than the eternal battle of the sexes, literally sometimes battle of the sexes, the tension, the animosity, the anger, the accusations. All of that is flying around our culture right now, and it deeply grieves me. You have a whole entire radical feminism that not in all cases, but in many cases, just pointing the finger at men and saying they are the problem, men are the problem. If we could just get rid of all the men, we could be just fine. And then you have a whole bunch of reactive men who then point the finger back at them, say all women are just manipulative, nasty, jerks, whatever. And it's just this fighting. And I would hope and pray that by God's grace, we actually can show our world something better in our marriages, in our church, in our friendships. Ultimately, we are going to look to Jesus. He demonstrated the ultimate model of the whole human design. If you think about the cross was at the same time both an act of sacrificial leadership and an act of humble submitting. Do you see that? I think Jesus is the image, ultimately, of godly masculinity because he is the one who used his power, not for his own good, but to take responsibility for lost and sinful and corrupt human beings, and that culminated in him giving his life on the cross for us. At the same time, the Bible says, Philippians chapter 2, that the cross was Jesus submitting himself to the Father. And I think in that moment, in the cross, Jesus gives us a model not just of godly masculinity, but actually of godly femininity as well. At the very same time, Jesus is not just for men. He does not just teach men to be godly, mature men. Jesus is good news for women too. He teaches women to be godly, mature women. In Jesus, we find the model for all of us. So, may we all look to him, to the cross, and humble ourselves in order to learn how we are to live as godly men and women. There's a stab there at what it means to be a godly masculine man or a godly feminine woman. I encourage you to take this conversation. I knew that regardless of whatever I could do today, what I was hoping to do is start a conversation that's really very tricky and difficult. And I encourage you to continue it in your families, in your friendships, in your small groups, in whatever places that you gather with people. Ask each other, what do you think it means to be a godly masculine man? What do you think it means to be a godly feminine woman? And I'm hoping that we can be encouraged by the Word of God today, but that you would continue, reflect and meditate on that reality. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we confess this is an area that's very near and dear and touchy It's difficult and tricky. We're surrounded on many sides by many different thoughts, many different answers, and a lot of confusion. And if we're honest, I think that, Father, I just confess that sometimes we're not even at peace with ourselves. We don't know if we are the kind of men we're supposed to be or the kind of women. So I pray that you teach us by your Spirit, teach us by your word, help us to encourage one another, help us to give insight to one another. I pray that you would lead us into the kind of men and women that you have created us to be, and that you would do this through